Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there, wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. This the narrator of Edgar Allan Poe's poem, The Raven, states as he looks out of the door, unaware that this fellow is about to come haunt him forever. The Raven is a classic and representative poem of the American Gothic genre, which I'd like to do a bit of a shallow dive into. Compared to England, America was seen as a new nation of liberty and democracy,
which must have come as a surprise to all the slaves.
However, there were many conflicts against that notion. For instance, and not limited to, wars against indigenous peoples, darker aspects of Puritan society, such as witch hunts, as well as the horrors of slavery. The settings of the American Gothic are distinctly American. Unlike in Europe, there aren't many fancy Gothic castles with long histories to set stories in, so they usually take place in locations such as frontiers and the wilderness. Later, this included the American South. Dr. Kara Johnson stated that the landscape in these stories is often used to symbolize the beliefs, priorities, and anxieties of the genre's characters and communities. First, as apt for Americans, there is more emphasis on the individual. This can be seen in the common theme of irrationality versus rationality. The American Gothic usually moves away from haunted buildings and so-called haunted houses and towards the haunted person. So, while there is still paranormal horror, it is often a question of whether the horror stems from the protagonist's own madness. Besides the protagonist's mental state, though, the other thing that contributes to the horrors that occur in the plot is history. In terms of family, the genre often presents mental illness as hereditary, depicts the historical wrongs of a family coming back to haunt one of its descendants, or shows certain traumatic events in the past affect family members later on. Meanwhile, in terms of country, according to Penguin Random House, the American Gothic often looks at events such as slavery, genocide, and the destruction of wilderness. Washington Irving's 1820 story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, is considered the first story of the genre. In this story, a teacher named Ichabod Crane may or may not have survived an encounter with what may or may not have been the legendary Headless Horseman. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow displays many of the elements characteristic of American Gothic literature. For example, the setting. Ichabod Crane's encounter with the Headless Horseman occurs in an oppressive, spooky woods at night, next to a town that has, quote-unquote, drowsy, dreamy, witching influences. Town superstitions also play an important part in the story, including ghosts, haunted trees, and the supernatural, in the form of the Headless Horseman, who rises each night from his grave in search of his head. Finally, the display of the irrational, in this case, fear. Irving describes Ichabod's terrified mental state and flight after his encounter with the Headless Horseman in great detail. As Ichabod approached this fearful tree, he began to whistle. He thought his whistle was answered. It was but a blast sweeping sharply through the dry branches. As he approached a little nearer, he thought he saw something white, hanging in the midst of the tree. He paused and ceased whistling, but, on looking more narrowly, perceived that it was a place where the tree had been scathed by lightning, and the white wood lay bare. Suddenly, he heard a groan. His teeth chattered, and his knees smote against the saddle. It was but the rubbing of one huge bow upon another, as they were swayed about by the breeze. He passed the tree in safety, but new perils lay before him. Edgar Allan Poe, the master of the macabre, was known for his masterful crafting of foreboding atmospheres, as well as his usage of unreliable narrators to further fuel the question of whether the terrible ordeals the protagonist goes through comes from the outside or from within. Some themes he was concerned with include mortality, the irrational, the supernatural, and the human tendency for self-destruction, some of which we will see in the two pieces of work below. One of Poe's most well-known short stories is 1839's The Fall of the House of Usher, in which an unnamed narrator receives a letter from his childhood friend, Roderick Usher, begging him to visit his mansion, as he believes his family is cursed and that he is dying. It is set in the crumbling, or perhaps haunted, mansion, which reflects the state of the Usher family itself. The mansion is presented in the beginning almost as a character itself, as seen in its vacant eye-like windows. Roderick Usher even goes so far as to claim that the mansion is responsible for his worsening health. Poe's fondness for describing the irrational is also seen in Roderick Usher's gradual worsening mental state. This is caused by both guilt and the fulfillment of the self-fulfilling prophecy. Roderick believes he and his sister are going to die. Therefore, he performs the actions that he does, which ultimately leads to the family's end. Finally, there is a pervasive sense of doom throughout the story that is created by Poe's descriptive language to talk about the horrid condition of the house, its inhabitants, and the feeling of dread that endlessly creeps upon them. The foreshadowing in the part where the narrator reads to Roderick leads up to the climax of the story. Within view of the melancholy house of Usher. I know not how it was, but with the first glimpse of the building a sense of insufferable gloom pervaded my spirit. I looked upon the scene before me, upon the vacant eye-like windows, with an utter depression of soul which I can compare to no earthly sensation more properly than to the after-dream of the reveller upon opium. There was an iciness, a sinking, a sickening of the heart, an unredeemed dreariness of thought which no goading of the imagination could torture into aught of the sublime. What was it, I paused to think, what was it that so unnerved me in the contemplation of the house of Usher? I was forced to fall back upon the unsatisfactory conclusion that while, beyond doubt, there are combinations of very simple natural objects which have the power of thus affecting us, still the analysis of this power lies among considerations beyond our depth. A personal favorite of mine is Poe's 1845 poem, The Raven, in which a grieving man is driven mad by a bird. The narrator is alone, haunted by the past and the memory of his lost loved one, Lenore, while the raven then comes in as a symbol of the narrator's everlasting grief. Again, Poe puts focus on the rational versus the irrational. Many of the raven's actions can be explained rationally and logically, as stated by the narrator himself. For instance, the raven is obviously only capable of repeating the word nevermore, yet the narrator keeps asking it questions that will lead to an unsatisfactory answer, which finally drives him mad. On a side note, Poe actually wrote a whole-ass essay about how he structured the poem, which is super interesting, so I highly recommend you go read that. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, and his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming. And the lamplight over him, streaming, throws his shadow on the floor, and my soul from that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. These are some examples of classic literature of the American Gothic. The genre would later expand to discuss issues such as feminism and slavery. Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper is a great example of this expansion. It is a story in which a postpartum woman is confined in a room and begins to believe there is a woman trapped behind the walls. The narrator is subjected to the rest cure. She is confined and alone in her room and allowed to do absolutely nothing. Thus, she starts to stare obsessively at the ugly yellow wallpaper in her room. The story is mostly about the protagonist's powerlessness and subsequent descent into madness. She desires to be free and right, but society, her husband, and the doctors of the time do not allow her to. What is truly terrifying, and what drives the protagonist insane in the end, is not supernatural being, or even any sort of human evil stemming within her mind. Rather, it is the confinements and unjust treatments faced by women at the time. I really have discovered something at last. Through watching so much at night, when the wallpaper changes so, I have finally found out. The front pattern does move, and no wonder. The woman behind shakes it. Sometimes I think there are a great many women behind, and sometimes only one. And she crawls around fast and her crawling shakes it all over. Then, in the very bright spots, she keeps still. And in the very shady spots, she just takes hold of the bars and shakes them hard. And she is all the time trying to climb through. But nobody could climb through that pattern. It strangles so. The Southern Gothic is a subgenre of the American Gothic, set in, obviously, the American South. According to Dr. Johnson, the genre represents, quote-unquote, tension between a dangerously false, nostalgic representation of American slavery with the economic, social, and physical realities of slavery and its aftermath in American history. Many issues and/or elements include madness, decay, racial hostilities, evil disguised as good, and dangers of clinging to tradition or nostalgia for the past. Here, I'd like to take a quick look at a few lines from Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find, in which a family heads towards Florida, knowing that there is a murderer on the road. In my time, said the grandmother, folding her thin, vain fingers, children were more respectful of their native states and their parent and everything else. People did right then. A good man is hard to find, Red Sammy said. Everything is getting terrible. I remember the day you could go off and leave your screen door unlatched. Not no more. He and the grandmother discussed better times. Perhaps one of the most well-known authors of later developments of the genre was Shirley Jackson. Even if you haven't heard of her name, you will have heard about her novel, The Haunting of Hill House, which was recently adapted into a Netflix series. However, instead, I'd like to turn to her short story, The Lottery, in which a small town gathers for an annual ritual that reveals the unsettling power of tradition and conformity. It displays people's stubbornness towards tradition, even if it is harmful, and especially if it is in the name of religion. It also showcases perfectly the evil in people, but this you'll have to read to the end to see for yourself. The original paraphernalia for the lottery had been lost long ago, and the black box now resting on the stool had been put into use even before Old Man Warner, the oldest man in town, was born. But no one liked to upset even as much tradition as was represented by the black box. Some places have already quit lotteries, Mrs. Adams said. Nothing but trouble with that, Old Man Warner said stoutly. Pack of young fools. Obviously, entertainment is a pretty big reason. We humans have a certain odd tendency to like to scare ourselves, no matter if it is due to the paranormal or grounded in reality. The reason why the horror genre still persists today. Gothic literature can fulfill our desire to read about both of those things, but I'd like to go a bit deeper than that. Gothic literature has always been a reactionary genre, presenting and reflecting certain issues in society and history, and challenging readers to think about them. I believe that this can also be said about literature in general. I would like to borrow a few lines from Elizabeth Barrett Browning. The work of writers, quote unquote, is to represent the age, creating living art, which thus presents and thus records true life. We can look into literature as a mirror of the past and think about the present and what we want for the future. Finally, the genre is about introspection. It is about confronting your own past and the ghosts that haunt it. We are all products of our circumstances and experiences, and we all have skeletons in our closet. These influence our present-day choices, whether you realize it or not. So, if you have the chance, open up that mental closet of yours and try to deal with the things that lay inside.